December 3, 1941. Port of Murmansk, Soviet Union. The temperature stood at -22 degrees Fahrenheit when Dmitry Volkov, a dock supervisor for the Soviet Merchant Marine, watched a Liberty ship from New York maneuver through ice floes into the harbor. 34 years old, party member since 1935, veteran of 12 years managing cargo operations. Volkov expected weapons. The Americans had promised tanks, aircraft, ammunition under the new Lend-Lease agreement. Instead, when the crane lifted the first cargo net from the hold, Volkov saw wooden crates stamped with words he recognized from his mandatory English classes. Wisconsin Cheese Company, 50 pounds net weight. Volkov ordered the crate opened. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, sat blocks of yellow cheese. Not weapons, not ammunition. Food. His first reaction was confusion, then anger. Soviet soldiers were dying 800 miles south of Moscow. The German army stood 15 miles from the Kremlin, and the Americans sent cheese. But as Volkov watched more crates emerge from the hold, crates marked lard, sugar, canned pork, flour, condensed milk, the confusion shifted to something else. Recognition. The Americans understood something Stalin's logistics officers were only beginning to calculate. The Soviet Union was about to starve. Operation Barbarossa had launched on June 22, 1941. 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in the largest military invasion in history. By September, German forces had captured Ukraine's breadbasket, the fertile Black Earth region that produced 60% of Soviet grain. By October, Wehrmacht units controlled Soviet industrial centers that processed 40% of the nation's meat and dairy. By November, the Leningrad blockade had sealed 2.5 million civilians inside a city with food reserves calculated to last 35 days. The mathematics of starvation were being written across the Soviet Union in real time. Soviet agricultural production for 1941 would reach only 38% of 1940 levels. The harvest that should have yielded 95 million tons of grain would yield 55 million tons. Livestock herds that numbered 54 million cattle in June numbered 31 million cattle by December. The deficit wasn't a shortage. It was a famine that would kill millions if the trajectory continued. Stalin understood the calculation. Soviet generals refused to speak aloud. The Red Army required 4,000 calories per soldier daily to maintain combat effectiveness in winter conditions. With 6.5 million men under arms by December 1941, that meant 26,000 tons of food daily, 9.5 million tons annually. Soviet domestic production, even before the German invasion, struggled to meet civilian and military needs simultaneously. Now, with Ukraine occupied and 25 million Soviet citizens under German control, the food system had collapsed. Moscow residents received 400 grams of bread daily, less than 1 pound. Leningrad residents received 125 grams, about 2 slices. Soviet civilians were starving so the army could eat. But even that sacrifice wasn't enough. By December 1941, Soviet food reserves stood at 2.3 million tons, enough to feed the Red Army for 87 days at full rations. After that, the mathematics turned dark. Soldiers would weaken, then sicken, then die. Not from German bullets, but from hunger. Meanwhile, 5,000 miles west, American farmers faced the opposite problem: abundance. Catastrophic, price-destroying abundance. The Dust Bowl had ended. New Deal agricultural programs had worked. Hybrid corn varieties increased yields by 20%. Mechanization had accelerated. Tractors numbered 1.6 million across American farms, replacing horses and human labor. The result was surplus so massive it threatened economic collapse. In autumn 1941, American grain elevators held 600 million bushels of wheat, the largest stockpile in history. Corn production reached 2.6 billion bushels. The United States produced 10 billion pounds of pork annually, 15 billion pounds of beef, 110 billion pounds of milk. American agricultural capacity had exceeded domestic consumption by such margins that prices collapsed. Wheat that cost farmers 87 cents per bushel to grow sold for 72 cents. Corn cost 63 cents to produce, sold for 52 cents. American farmers were going bankrupt producing food nobody could afford to buy, while Soviet citizens starved 5,000 miles away. President Roosevelt saw the symmetry. Soviet survival depended on calories. American economic stability depended on markets. Lend-Lease, announced in March 1941, had focused on military hardware, tanks, aircraft, trucks. But by October 1941, Soviet Ambassador Maxim Litvinov was requesting something different. Food. Massive quantities of food. His request, delivered to the State Department on October 23rd, specified needs: 500,000 tons of wheat, 300,000 tons of canned meat, 200,000 tons of lard and butter, 150,000 tons of sugar. The numbers seemed impossible. Soviet officials didn't believe America could deliver such quantities while simultaneously feeding its own military, which would expand to 12 million men by 1943. American military planners resisted. Ships should carry weapons, not groceries. Every ton of butter meant one less ton of ammunition. But Roosevelt overruled them. On November 7, 1941, he authorized food shipments under Lend-Lease. The first convoy departed New York on November 28, 1941, carrying 12,000 tons of food in 8 cargo ships. The manifest included 3,000 tons of canned pork, 2,000 tons of lard, 2,000 tons of flour, 1,500 tons of sugar, 500 tons of cheese, and 3,000 tons of miscellaneous provisions. This convoy, which arrived at Murmansk on December 3rd, represented a test shipment. Soviet logistics officers calculated that 12,000 tons would feed 200,000 soldiers for 1 week. They requested 10 times more for January. The American response, delivered through diplomatic channels on December 9th, stated that the United States could provide 100 times the December shipment over the next 12 months. Soviet officials believed this was a translation error or American propaganda. The scale seemed impossible. What arrived in December was merely the test. What was coming would redefine industrial food production as a weapon of war. January 1942. The United States Department of Agriculture headquarters in Washington coordinated what would become the largest agricultural mobilization in American history. Secretary of Agriculture Claude Wickard faced a challenge no American official had confronted before: feed a foreign army of 6.5 million men while simultaneously supplying American forces and maintaining civilian consumption. The solution required transforming American abundance from economic liability into strategic weapon. Wickard's staff calculated Soviet requirements: 500,000 tons of food monthly, 6 million tons annually. This exceeded the total food imports of Britain, which itself was receiving massive American shipments. The USDA established county-by-county production quotas in December 1941, delivered to agricultural extension agents across 3,000 American counties. Each county received specific targets based on capacity and specialty. Iowa received orders to increase pork production by 40%. The state's 213,000 farms already produce more pork than any nation except the United States itself. Iowa hogs numbered 8.8 million in 1941. The USDA target for 1942 was 12.3 million hogs, an increase of 3.5 million animals. County agents met with farmers to coordinate breeding schedules, feed supplies, and processing capacity. The average Iowa farm maintained 40 hogs. Under the wartime program, that number would rise to 58. Wisconsin received orders to double cheese production. The state produced 380 million pounds of cheese in 1941, primarily cheddar and Swiss varieties. The 1942 target was £760 million. Wisconsin's 125,000 dairy farms increased milking operations. Cheese factories in Monroe, Plymouth, and Sheboygan installed additional vats and hired second shifts. Kansas expanded wheat acreage by 2 million acres. The state's wheat production in 1941 reached 143 million bushels. The 1942 target was 203 million bushels, requiring farmers to plant wheat on land previously used for other crops or left fallow. The machinery that made this expansion possible represented the fundamental difference between American and Soviet agriculture. American farmers operated 1.6 million tractors in 1942. Soviet collective farms operated approximately 450,000 tractors, most of which were now behind German lines or had been evacuated east of the Urals. American tractors averaged 25 horsepower and could plow 40 acres daily. Soviet tractors averaged 15 horsepower and frequently broke down due to poor maintenance and fuel quality. The productivity differential was stark. The average American farmer in 1942 produced enough food to feed 18 people. The average Soviet farmer produced enough food to feed 4 people. American combine harvesters numbered 190,000, mechanical devices that could harvest 50 acres of wheat daily. Soviet collective farms relied primarily on manual labor with scythes and hand tools. This mechanization advantage meant American agriculture could increase output by 15% while actually reducing labor input by 10%, as young men left farms for military service. Women, older men, and teenagers operated the machinery their husbands, fathers, and sons had operated before conscription. The food that American farms produced required processing before it could survive the journey to Soviet ports. Meatpacking plants in Chicago, Omaha, and Kansas City operated continuously. Swift & Company's plant in Chicago processed 50,000 hogs weekly in 1941. By mid-1942, that number reached 75,000 hogs weekly, with additional shifts processing cattle and sheep. The meat was canned in tin containers that could withstand Arctic temperatures and rough handling. Armour & Company developed specialized canning techniques for wartime conditions. Standard commercial canning used temperatures of 240 degrees Fahrenheit for 75 minutes. Armour's military specification canning used 250 degrees for 90 minutes, creating a seal that could survive temperature fluctuations from -40 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit. Every 10th can was opened and tested. Rejection rates ran at 0.3%, meaning 3 cans per 1,000 were discarded for seal failures or contamination. The volume was extraordinary. Springfield, Illinois, operated a facility exclusively for Soviet contracts that produced 1 million cans weekly, 52 million cans annually, containing 18 million pounds of processed pork. Dehydration technology transformed perishable foods into stable powders. Eggs were broken, mixed, and spray-dried into powder that weighed 1/8 of the original liquid weight. A railroad car that could transport 20,000 pounds of fresh eggs could transport 160,000 pounds of egg equivalent as powder. Milk underwent similar processing. Whole milk was condensed and dried, reducing 100 pounds of liquid milk to 10 pounds of powder. Potatoes were cooked, mashed, and dried into flakes. The science behind dehydration involved precise temperature and humidity control. Eggs were dried at 145 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity maintained at 15%. Higher temperatures damaged protein structures. Higher humidity prevented complete drying, allowing bacterial growth. The processing plants achieved consistency that Soviet food scientists, reviewing samples, could not explain. American quality control exceeded Soviet capabilities by margins that seemed impossible. The challenge became transportation. 3 routes emerged, each with distinct difficulties. The Arctic convoy route from New York and Boston to Murmansk covered 2,000 nautical miles through waters where German U-boats and surface raiders operated. Convoy PQ-13 in March 1942 lost 5 of 19 ships. Convoy PQ-17 in July 1942 suffered catastrophic losses. 24 of 35 ships sunk. But the food ships that survived delivered their cargo intact. The SS Carleton, carrying 5,000 tons of lard and canned meat, reached Murmansk on July 28, 1942, after its convoy was attacked for 6 days. Sailors aboard the Carleton watched other ships explode and sink while they defended cargo that included 8 million cans of pork. The Persian corridor offered an alternative: ships to Iranian ports, then trucks overland 5,000 miles to Soviet territory. This route avoided U-boats but introduced different challenges. Trucks carrying Iowa pork crossed Iranian deserts, where temperatures reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Drivers worried that canned goods would explode from heat expansion. They didn't. American canning specifications had accounted for extreme heat. The Pacific route through Vladivostok required avoiding Japanese naval forces. Ships hugged the Aleutian Islands, traveling through fog and ice to reach Soviet Pacific ports. By December 1942, American food shipments to the Soviet Union reached 120,000 tons monthly, 10 times the December 1941 test shipment. But Soviet distribution systems couldn't handle the volume. Warehouses in Murmansk overflowed with American canned goods stacked 40 feet high. Railroad cars sat frozen on sidings, unable to move because Soviet locomotives lacked fuel or spare parts. Meanwhile, Leningrad starved 1,000 miles southeast, and Stalingrad fought for survival 2,000 miles south. American advisors arrived in January 1943 to help Soviet logistics officers manage distribution. The cultural collision was immediate. Americans were shocked by Soviet waste. Trainloads of powdered eggs spoiled because Soviet cooks didn't know reconstitution ratios. Soviets were shocked by American abundance. The casual assumption that more food would always arrive, that losses to spoilage or mishandling didn't matter because replacement shipments were already en route. The gap between American plenty and Soviet scarcity was being measured in millions of tons, and the war's outcome was being written in warehouses where butter and lard sat stacked like ammunition. August 23, 1942. The German Sixth Army reached the Volga River at Stalingrad. General Friedrich Paulus commanded 330,000 men, 500 tanks and 7,000 artillery pieces. His orders from Hitler were simple: capture the city, cut Soviet supply lines on the Volga, and destroy Stalin's namesake city. The battle that followed would become the turning point of the Eastern Front, decided not by tactics or courage, but by calories. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov commanded the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad. By September 15th, his forces were surrounded on 3 sides, pressed against the Volga River with their backs to the water. Chuikov's soldiers fought house to house, room to room, sometimes floor by floor, in apartment buildings. But Chuikov faced a problem his German counterpart didn't yet understand. His army was starving. Soviet soldiers in Stalingrad received 1,200 calories daily in September 1942, barely enough to sustain basic metabolic function. Combat operations required 3,500 calories daily. The mathematics were brutal. Soldiers operating on deficit rations lost strength, lost focus, lost the ability to fight effectively. Chuikov calculated that his army could maintain combat effectiveness for approximately 3 weeks before starvation reduced his force to immobility. The Volga River provided the only supply route into the city. Barges crossed at night under German artillery fire, carrying ammunition, medical supplies and food. But the tonnage was insufficient. On November 15th, Soviet food reserves in Stalingrad reached a 3-day supply. After that, the 62nd Army would collapse not from German attacks, but from hunger. The crisis point had arrived. That same night, a convoy of trucks reached the eastern bank of the Volga, carrying cargo that had travelled 8,000 miles from Chicago. The manifest listed 40 tons of canned meat, 15 tons of lard, 8 tons of powdered eggs, and 12 tons of sugar. American food, shipped to Murmansk in October, transported by rail to the Volga region, now waiting to cross the frozen river into Stalingrad. Soviet logistics officers loaded the supplies onto barges after midnight. German artillery had ranges and firing solutions for the crossing points, making daylight crossing suicidal. The barges crossed in darkness, navigating by starlight and compass. At 03:20 hours on November 16th, the first barge reached the western bank inside Stalingrad's perimeter. Soldiers unloaded crates stamped with English words they couldn't read. Armour, Swift, Hormel. Soviet soldiers opened the cans with bayonets. Inside was meat they had never seen before, pressed and pink and preserved in gelatin. The Americans called it Spam, a contraction of spiced ham. Soviet soldiers called it victory meat. The taste was salty, fatty, dense with calories. Men who had subsisted on bread and thin soup for weeks ate the canned meat directly from the tins. One can contained 1,080 calories, nearly a full day's ration in a single container. The powdered eggs were mixed with water and fried in American lard. The sugar was spooned directly into tea or eaten plain for instant energy. Within 48 hours, Soviet rations in Stalingrad increased from 1,200 calories to 3,200 calories daily. Medical officers noted immediate changes. Soldiers reported less fatigue, better concentration, fewer cases of frostbite as their bodies had calories to burn for warmth. Combat effectiveness increased measurably. The contrast across the front lines was stark. German soldiers inside Stalingrad received adequate rations through October 1942, approximately 2,800 calories daily. But by November, as Soviet forces encircled the city, German supply lines weakened. Luftwaffe transport aircraft attempted to resupply the trapped Sixth Army, but winter weather and Soviet fighters reduced delivery efficiency. By December 1942, German soldiers in Stalingrad received 700 calories daily. They ate their horses. They boiled. Leather boots for soup. They fought with the desperation of starving men. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers besieging them ate American canned pork, American cheese, American chocolate bars that came in Red Cross packages. On November 19th, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive counter-offensive that encircled the German Sixth Army. Paulus and 250,000 German soldiers were trapped inside Stalingrad with inadequate food supplies. The Luftwaffe attempted emergency airlift operations, but Soviet anti-aircraft defenses and winter storms limited deliveries to 100 tons daily. The trapped German army required 500 tons of supplies daily to maintain combat readiness, including 300 tons of food. The shortfall was catastrophic. By Christmas 1942, German soldiers were reduced to starvation rations. Photographs taken by German soldiers in December show men with sunken faces and hollow eyes, wearing uniforms that hung loose on frames that had lost 30 or 40 pounds. Soviet intelligence officers who interrogated German prisoners in January 1943 were shocked by their physical condition. One German officer, captured on January 12th, weighed 118 pounds and stood 5 feet 10 inches tall. Before the battle, he had weighed 165 pounds. Soviet soldiers sharing their rations with German prisoners created moments of surreal contrast. A Soviet private named Ivan Konovalov gave a starving German prisoner a Hershey chocolate bar from an American Red Cross package. The German soldier, who spoke some Russian, asked where the chocolate came from. Konovalov explained, "America." The German's confusion was documented in his post-war memoir. He had been told Americans were weak, that Soviet industry was primitive, that the Reich would win through superior organization. Yet here he sat, a prisoner, eating American chocolate given to him by a Soviet soldier who had more food than German armies could provide their own men. The ideology shattered against the reality of a chocolate bar. The Battle of Stalingrad ended on February 2, 1943. German forces surrendered. Approximately 91,000 German soldiers entered Soviet captivity, many too weak to walk. Soviet casualties were enormous: 478,000 killed, 651,000 wounded. But Soviet armies had held, had fought, had won. Post-battle analysis by both Soviet and German military historians identified food supply as a critical factor. German soldiers weakened by starvation could not maintain defensive positions. Soviet soldiers sustained by American rations maintained offensive pressure. The caloric advantage had become a military advantage. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, American food shipments to the Soviet Union reached 664,000 tons of meat and fats, 675,000 tons of sugar, 345,000 tons of canned goods, and 1.2 million tons of flour and grain. This volume represented enough food to feed 10 million people for 1 year at survival rations, or to feed the entire Red Army of 6.5 million men at full combat rations with substantial surplus remaining. The cost was $1.3 billion in 1942 dollars. This single year of American food aid provided more calories than the entire city of Chicago consumed in 18 months. The mathematics of abundance had defeated the mathematics of starvation, and Stalingrad proved that wars could be won in cornfields and dairy farms as decisively as on battlefields. Spring 1943. American agricultural production reached levels that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Farms across the Midwest achieved maximum output through a combination of mechanization, scientific coordination, and relentless focus on efficiency. Nebraska ranchers increased beef cattle herds from 3.2 million head in 1941 to 4.1 million head by spring 1943, a 28% increase in 2 years. Idaho potato farmers expanded acreage from 140,000 acres to 195,000 acres, using improved seed varieties that yielded 320 hundredweight per acre compared to 260 hundredweight in 1941. California orchards produced dried fruit at record volumes: 180,000 tons of raisins, 65,000 tons of prunes, 42,000 tons of dried apricots. These weren't subsistence crops. These were luxury items, foods that provided variety and morale beyond mere survival calories. The efficiency gains defied conventional agricultural economics. American farms produced 15% more food in 1943 than in 1941, while employing 10% fewer workers. Young men had left for military service, creating labor shortages that should have reduced output. Instead, machinery compensated. Tractors that sat idle in barns during the Depression now operated 16 hours daily during planting and harvest seasons. Mechanical corn pickers, which numbered 110,000 nationwide in 1941, increased to 185,000 by 1943. These machines could harvest 100 acres in the time it took manual laborers to harvest 10 acres. International Harvester and John Deere factories operated triple shifts, producing agricultural equipment at volumes that exceeded pre-war civilian demand by 300%. Women and older men operated equipment their sons and husbands had operated before conscription. Farm wives who had previously managed household duties learned to drive tractors, operate grain augers, and repair machinery. The Iowa State Extension Service coordinated this transition through county agents who provided technical training and connected farms with replacement labor. Every county agent knew Soviet requirements and planned local production accordingly. This coordination wasn't centralized command economy like Soviet collective farms. This was distributed coordination through information sharing and price incentives. The USDA published monthly bulletins listing Soviet needs. 50,000 tons of coffee required for Red Army rations, 75,000 tons of chocolate needed for morale packages, 120,000 tons of dried fruit requested for field rations. American processors responded not through government orders, but through contracts. Nestlé increased chocolate production by signing Soviet supply contracts worth $15 million. Hills Brothers Coffee expanded operations to meet Soviet demand, producing 45 million pounds of coffee in 1943 compared to 32 million pounds in 1941. The Soviet Union had no coffee production capability. Soviet citizens had rarely tasted coffee before the war. Now, Red Army soldiers received coffee as standard ration, all of it American, all of it shipped across oceans and delivered to frontline units. The variety of American shipments expanded beyond survival rations. Soviet requests in 1943 included items that would have seemed absurd in 1941. 15,000 tons of raisins, 8,000 tons of prunes, 12,000 tons of dried apricots, 3,000 tons of pepper and spices, 50,000 tons of coffee beans, 25,000 tons of cocoa powder and chocolate bars. These weren't emergency famine relief. These were items that boosted morale, that reminded soldiers they were fighting for something beyond mere existence. Soviet officers noted the psychological impact in after-action reports. A Soviet company commander in Ukraine wrote in March 1943 that his men's morale improved significantly when American rations arrived. The rations included items Soviet soldiers had never tasted: instant coffee with sugar packets, chocolate bars in wrappers with English writing, chewing gum that confused soldiers who didn't understand you weren't supposed to swallow it. One Soviet veteran recalled decades later that an American field ration contained better food than his family's pre-war civilian diet. The ration included canned meat, crackers with cheese spread, instant coffee, sugar cubes, a chocolate bar, cigarettes, and chewing gum. His family in peacetime had eaten black bread, cabbage soup, and potatoes, with meat perhaps once weekly. The comparison with German rations revealed the industrial gap. German soldiers in 1943 received rations that were purely functional and decreasing in quality. The standard German field ration included hardtack biscuits, canned meat of dubious origin, ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, and limited chocolate reserves for officers only. As the war progressed and German supply lines weakened, even these basic rations became irregular. Wehrmacht quartermasters struggled to feed armies operating across thousands of miles of occupied territory. By contrast, Soviet armies advancing westward in 1943 maintained consistent supply lines supported by American food shipments. The Red Army could advance 20 miles daily and still receive full rations because American logistics filled the gap Soviet production couldn't cover. Soviet logistics officers calculated requirements with brutal precision. An army advancing 20 miles daily required 400 tons of supplies per division, of which 180 tons was food. The Red Army fielded approximately 400 divisions by summer 1943, requiring 72,000 tons of food daily, 26 million tons annually. Soviet agricultural production in 1943, even with some liberated territory returning to cultivation, reached only 14 million tons. The 12 million ton gap was filled by American shipments. Without this food, Soviet armies would need to pause advances to requisition food from liberated territories or wait for harvest seasons. American food eliminated that constraint. Soviet offensives at Kursk in July 1943 and the liberation of Ukraine through autumn 1943 occurred without pause for agricultural cycles. The momentum was sustained by consistent American resupply. The Studebaker trucks that carried this food became as important as the food itself. Under Lend-Lease, America delivered 150,000 trucks to the Soviet Union by end of 1943. These vehicles, built in South Bend, Indiana, and shipped across 3 oceans to Soviet ports, provided mobility Soviet industry couldn't match. Soviet truck production in 1943 reached 50,000 vehicles, mostly lower quality than American models. The Studebaker US-6, a 2.5-ton truck with 6-wheel drive, became the standard Soviet military transport. These same trucks that delivered American food to frontline units also carried ammunition, medical supplies, and troops. Soviet soldiers called them Studers, and photographs from 1943 show convoys of hundreds of these American trucks stretching for miles along Ukrainian roads. The indirect impact extended beyond frontline armies. Soviet industrial workers producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery in Ural mountain factories ate rations that were 60% American in content. The Stalingrad complex in Chelyabinsk employed 40,000 workers producing T-34 tanks at a rate of 1,500 monthly by late 1943. These workers received rations that included American canned meat, American lard, American flour, and American sugar. Soviet planners calculated that without American food, factory productivity would decline by 30–40% as malnourished workers couldn't maintain production pace. The connection was direct. Iowa farmers enabled Ural factory workers who produced tanks that defeated German armies. American agricultural abundance freed Soviet resources for military production. Every ton of American wheat meant 1 less ton Soviet agriculture needed to produce, allowing Soviet farms to focus on maintaining minimal civilian rations while industry consumed available food. The system worked because American capacity was so vast it could simultaneously feed its own military of 12 million men, maintain civilian consumption at levels that exceeded pre-war standards, and provide surplus sufficient to sustain Soviet war effort. The 4.5 million tons of food shipped to the Soviet Union in 1943 represented only 3% of total American agricultural production. This marginal allocation, trivial by American standards, meant survival for the Soviet Union. January 27, 1944. The 872-day siege of Leningrad ended when Soviet forces drove German armies back from the city's perimeter. The siege had begun on September 8, 1941. Trapping 2.5 million civilians and 300,000 soldiers inside a city that would become history's deadliest blockade. Approximately 800,000 Leningrad residents died from starvation, cold, and disease during those 872 days. The death toll exceeded American casualties for the entire war, but the siege's final year showed a pattern different from the catastrophic winter of 1941–42, when residents died by thousands daily. After 1942, American food reduced the death rate from mass starvation to endurable hardship. The ice road across Lake Ladoga, called the Road of Life by Leningrad residents, carried supplies into the besieged city throughout winter months when the lake froze solid enough to support truck traffic. In January 1943, convoys crossed the ice carrying American canned meat, American lard, American flour. A Leningrad resident named Yelena Skrzybina kept a diary throughout the siege, entries that documented the arrival of American food with clinical precision. On January 18, 1943, she wrote that her family received supplemental rations that included American canned meat for the first time in 15 months. She described opening the can and finding meat that looked and tasted unlike anything she remembered from before the war. The meat was pressed into a rectangular block, pink and fatty. She divided the can among 4 people: herself, her 2 sons, and her mother. Each person received approximately 3 ounces, roughly 250 calories. This single can, produced in a Chicago packing plant and transported 8,000 miles, kept 4 people alive for another day. Her diary entry noted that the can was stamped with English words and a date, October 1942, Food produced in America in October had reached starving Leningrad by January. The logistics seemed miraculous to residents who had watched their city's food supply collapse completely in winter 1941–42. The contrast between siege years was documented in Soviet medical records. During winter 1941–42, Leningrad residents received 125 grams of bread daily and virtually nothing else. This provided approximately 400 to 500 calories, less than 25% of adult nutritional requirements. The death rate peaked at 3,000 to 4,000 deaths daily in December 1941. Bodies lay in streets because survivors lacked strength to bury them. By contrast, winter 1943–44 saw rations increase to 400 grams of bread daily, plus supplemental foods, much of it American. Canned meat, powdered eggs, and lard increased caloric intake to approximately 1,500 calories daily. Still inadequate, still causing malnutrition and weakness, but sufficient to prevent mass death. Medical records show mortality rates declined to approximately 200 deaths daily in winter 1943–44, still tragic but 95% lower than the catastrophic winter 2 years earlier. American food didn't end the siege's suffering, but it prevented complete collapse. When Soviet armies liberated villages across Ukraine and Belarus in 1943 and 1944, they found civilian populations near starvation after years of German occupation. Wehrmacht forces had requisitioned food systematically, leaving local populations with minimal subsistence. Soviet military units distributed emergency rations to liberated civilians, rations that consisted primarily of American food. In the village of Katyn, Belarus, liberated in March 1944, Soviet soldiers found 147 residents, mostly women, children, and elderly. The village's food reserves had been depleted. German occupation forces had taken livestock, grain reserves, and seed stocks. Soviet soldiers distributed American canned meat and American powdered milk to the surviving children. A Katyn resident named Antonina Baeva recalled decades later receiving small cans of meat with English writing from Soviet soldiers. Her children, aged 5 and 7, had survived German occupation eating bark, grass, and occasional scraps. The American canned meat was the first protein they had eaten in months. The children didn't understand the cans came from across an ocean, from a country they had never heard of. But Baeva understood. Soviet soldiers explained that America was sending food to help fight Germans. The education about American capacity spread through liberated populations. Soviet citizens began understanding that their survival depended partly on American production. This knowledge created complex feelings: gratitude for the aid, confusion about how such abundance was possible, and questions about why America would help. Soviet propaganda emphasized Soviet heroism and German cruelty, but mentioned American aid only briefly and without detail. Yet the physical evidence was undeniable. Cans stamped with English, trucks with American markings, clothing with American labels. People could read the evidence even when official sources stayed silent. Meanwhile, in Iowa, farmer Harold Johnson managed 280 acres and raised approximately 200 hogs annually. In spring 1943, his county extension agent showed him a USDA pamphlet titled "Food Fights for Freedom" that explained where American agricultural production was going. The pamphlet included maps showing Lend-Lease routes to Britain and the Soviet Union. Johnson learned that pork from Iowa farms was feeding Soviet soldiers at the Battle of Kursk, then ongoing. His reaction, documented in a local newspaper interview from May 1943, expressed pride mixed with pragmatism. He stated that farming during wartime felt purposeful in ways farming during the Depression hadn't. During the 1930s, he produced food nobody could afford, watching prices collapse while families went hungry. Now in 1943, every hog he raised fed soldiers fighting against fascism. The connection between his farm and distant battlefields made abstract war effort concrete. Other farmers expressed similar sentiments. A Wisconsin dairy farmer told extension agents that knowing his milk became powdered milk for Soviet armies made morning milking feel important rather than routine. German intelligence services documented American food shipments with increasing alarm. Wehrmacht quartermaster reports from 1943 calculated Soviet logistics requirements and compared them against known Soviet production capacity. The numbers didn't match. Soviet armies were receiving more food than Soviet agriculture could produce. German analysts concluded correctly that American imports were filling the gap. A German Army Group Center intelligence report from December 1943 estimated Soviet food supply was 70% dependent on American imports for military rations. The report recommended increasing attacks on convoy routes and ports, but by late 1943, the Allies controlled too many routes for interdiction to be effective. Arctic convoys continued despite losses. Persian corridor shipments increased as Allied forces secured Iran. Pacific routes operated with minimal Japanese interference after American naval victories in 1942-43. German soldiers who captured Soviet positions in 1943 found evidence of American supply throughout. Abandoned Soviet field kitchens contained American canned goods, American coffee, American sugar. German soldiers opened these cans and ate the contents, experiencing American production capacity firsthand. Their letters home, intercepted by German military censors, expressed disbelief. How could America produce enough food to feed its own military, feed Britain, and feed the Soviet Union simultaneously while German civilians faced rationing and soldiers received decreasing rations? Post-war interrogations of German generals revealed that Soviet supply advantage was recognized as critical factor by 1943. General Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Kluge, stated in 1946 interrogation that German intelligence underestimated American productive capacity until too late. The assumption that America was weak, divided, and incapable of industrial coordination proved catastrophically wrong. German soldiers facing Soviet armies in 1943 weren't just facing numerical superiority. They were facing armies sustained by industrial capacity that exceeded German understanding. Every can of American meat represented a factory in Chicago. Every Studebaker truck represented industrial coordination across thousands of suppliers. The cumulative impact was overwhelming, and German forces were being defeated by an enemy that included Iowa farmers and Wisconsin dairy workers who never fired a shot, but who fed the armies that destroyed the Wehrmacht. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The final accounting of American food aid to the Soviet Union revealed numbers that exceeded initial projections and redefined what industrial agriculture could achieve during wartime. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped 4.5 million tons of food to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. This tonnage included 665,000 tons of meat and fats, 10,000 tons of sugar, 783,000 tons of canned goods, 1.9 million tons of wheat and flour, and 672,000 tons of miscellaneous provisions, including coffee, chocolate, dried fruit, and spices. To understand the scale, 4.5 million tons of food provided enough calories to give half a pound of food daily to 10 million people for 1,788 days, the entire duration of the war on the Eastern Front. Alternatively, this food could feed the entire Red Army at full combat rations of 4,000 calories daily for 3 years, or feed 20 million Soviet civilians at survival rations of 1,500 calories daily for the entire war period. The financial value was $1.3 billion in 1945 dollars, equivalent to approximately $26 billion in current value. This food aid alone exceeded total Soviet agricultural output in some categories during certain years. American meat shipments in 1943 equaled 40% of total Soviet meat production that year. American sugar shipments represented 50% of Soviet sugar consumption. The percentage of Soviet food supply coming from American sources fluctuated between 10% and 15% throughout the war, with higher percentages during crisis periods like Stalingrad. Without this supplement, Soviet military effectiveness would have declined measurably, and civilian death rates from starvation would have increased by estimated hundreds of thousands beyond the actual toll. Stalin acknowledged American aid privately while minimizing it publicly. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Stalin raised a toast to President Roosevelt, stating that American production had won the war. He praised American industrial capacity and specifically mentioned trucks, aircraft, and supplies. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who attended the conference, later wrote in his memoirs that Stalin told him privately, "Without American meat, we would have starved. Without American trucks, we would have nothing to haul our artillery with. Without American steel, we couldn't have produced tanks." But this private acknowledgement never became public Soviet policy. Post-war Soviet propaganda credited victory to Soviet workers, Soviet soldiers, and Communist Party leadership. American aid was mentioned briefly, if at all, described as minor assistance that helped but wasn't decisive. By the 1950s, Soviet history textbooks discussed World War II without mentioning Lend-Lease food shipments. An entire generation of Soviet citizens grew up not knowing American farmers had helped keep their parents and grandparents alive. Soviet veterans knew the truth because they had eaten the food, but they couldn't speak openly about it without contradicting official history. This erasure served political purposes as the Cold War intensified. Acknowledging dependence on American aid contradicted the narrative of Soviet self-sufficiency and superiority. The knowledge became classified, stored in archives that wouldn't open for decades. The Cold War began in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. American farmers who had fed Soviet armies now prepared to feed Western European populations while viewing the Soviet Union as enemy. The irony was profound and largely unrecognized. Americans had prevented Soviet starvation during wartime, then faced Soviet hostility during peacetime. Soviet beneficiaries of American abundance became citizens of a state behind the Iron Curtain, cut off from information about the aid that had sustained them. The Marshall Plan demonstrated that American agricultural capacity remained a strategic asset. The same farms and processing plants that had produced 4.5 million tons for the Soviet Union now produced food for Western Europe's reconstruction. American wheat rebuilt Italy. American meat fed France. American dairy products sustained West Germany. The capability demonstrated during World War II became a permanent feature of American foreign policy. In 1959, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev visited Iowa farms during his American tour. He toured cornfields and dairy operations, asking detailed questions about yields, mechanization, and productivity. Khrushchev understood American agricultural capacity because he had seen its output during the war. His famous statement that Soviet agriculture would overtake American agriculture was made with full knowledge that American farms had fed Soviet armies 15 years earlier. The visit highlighted the continuing gap. American farms in 1959 were more productive than American farms in 1943, while Soviet collective farms still struggled with inefficiency and low yields. Khrushchev's attempt to introduce American corn-growing methods to the Soviet Union largely failed because Soviet agriculture lacked the supporting infrastructure, machinery, fertilizer production, and distribution systems that made American abundance possible. Soviet archives opened in the 1990s after the Soviet Union's collapse. Historians gained access to Lend-Lease documents that had been classified for 45 years. The full scope of American food aid became public knowledge in Russia for the first time. Russian historians, particularly those at the Institute of Russian History, published detailed analyses acknowledging that American supplies were critical to Soviet survival. Veteran testimonies, previously suppressed, were collected and published. A Russian tank commander named Dmitry Loza, who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, stated in a 1990s interview that American canned meat was so common in Soviet frontline units that soldiers joked about fighting the war on Spam and Studebakers. Other veterans confirmed that American rations were superior to Soviet rations and appeared more consistently. These testimonies validated what Western historians had argued for decades. Lend-Lease was decisive. But broader Russian public awareness remained limited. The revelations from archives reached academic circles and interested historians but didn't penetrate popular consciousness. Most Russians today know about the Battle of Stalingrad and Soviet victory, but don't know about Iowa pork crossing the Volga or Wisconsin cheese feeding Leningrad. American public awareness is similarly limited. Most Americans know the United States sent military aid to allies during World War II, but don't know the specific scale of food shipments or that American farms prevented Soviet collapse. Today, a rusted Spam can sit in a display case at the Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow. The can was recovered from a battlefield near Kursk, dated 1943, manufactured in Austin, Minnesota. The placard explains briefly that American food supplies assisted Soviet forces. Museum visitors, mostly Russian families with children, walk past the exhibit quickly, focusing on tanks and artillery. The can doesn't look significant compared to a T-34 tank or a Katyusha rocket launcher. But that single can represents a system that produced 665,000 tons of meat, transported it across oceans under submarine attack, distributed it across 5,000 miles of territory, and delivered it to soldiers who used the calories to fight battles that determined the war's outcome. American agricultural abundance remains strategic capability. The farms that fed 20 million Soviets during World War II now feed hundreds of millions globally through exports and aid programs. Iowa still produces pork at volumes that exceed most nations' total production. Wisconsin still produces cheese that ships worldwide. Kansas wheat feeds populations across Africa and Asia. The system created during World War II to mobilize agricultural production established patterns and capabilities that persist 80 years later. The lesson was learned permanently. Productive capacity defeats scarcity. Abundance sustains alliances. And sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but through the simple act of feeding hungry people. The farmers who accomplished this never received medals, never appeared in newsreels, never understood fully that their work was as decisive as any general's strategy. They planted, harvested and shipped food that traveled thousands of miles to keep armies fighting and civilians alive. That was enough. It had to be enough, because it was everything.